Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, would it be a good idea to have tariffs on pharmaceuticals? Dr. Mariana Socal is a Johns Hopkins faculty member who studies the pharmaceutical market. She talks with Dr. Josh Sharfstein about the possible rationale for tariffs and the potential downsides, including higher drug prices. Let's listen.
Dr. Mariana Socal, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call to talk about tariffs on pharmaceuticals. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Could you just introduce yourself to our audience and what you study here at Johns Hopkins?
Certainly. My name is Mariana Socal. I'm an associate professor of health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I research all things related to pharmaceutical policy, primarily access, affordability, pricing, and also supply of pharmaceuticals.
So that brings us to our topic. President Trump has been talking a lot about tariffs these days, and tariff rates are changing based on various discussions that are happening. Occasionally, the president talks about tariffs on pharmaceuticals, and so that led me to send you an email and see whether you would explain to me what is going on.
Great question. There has been this movement towards implementing tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. from foreign countries. So far, pharmaceuticals have been exempt from tariffs, and that follows a historical trend. In fact, the U.S. is a signatory of a treaty that many countries around the world have also signed, and that treaty protects not only intellectual property of drugs, but also protects drugs from tariffs. The thinking behind these agreements and also the exemption of pharmaceuticals from tariffs is that, number one, pharmaceuticals are already of high cost in the United States. The high cost of medications underlies the fact that about 1 in 4 Americans reports not having been able to afford a prescription drug that they needed in the last year because they couldn't afford it, because they couldn't pay for it. So the cost of pharmaceuticals is generally high already. And the concern is that adding tariffs and it's basically works similarly to a tax, it would increase prices even further. And not only that, pharmaceuticals are today being produced all over the world, and they ship worldwide to many other consumers. And so the question about how this global market would operate under these different tariff schemes.
So tariffs for a long time have not been placed on pharmaceuticals, and it sounds like you think for some good reasons. Is this podcast over, or might we be looking at some tariffs on pharmaceuticals now?
I think one of the reasons why the administration has proposed to impose tariff on pharmaceuticals, and I should be clear that that matter is not settled yet. There is an investigation going on about the possible impacts from tariffs exactly to try to resolve this point. But one of the stated reasons for imposing tariffs on pharmaceuticals is to incentivize production in American soil. There is this long trend of outsourcing our drugs from other markets, from other countries, and the administration has shown concern about this dependency on global sources. And one of the ideas supporting the implementation of these tariffs that has been stated is to incentivize production in American soil.
In other words, if drugs are made somewhere else, they're going to be more costly. So a company might say, well, we might as well make them in the United States, and the United States would then have a more guaranteed supply. So if there were another pandemic or some other major global shock, people wouldn't go without their medicines here in the United States. Is that at least the idea?
I think that's the idea that has been proposed and the rationale that has been stated. The question is to what extent that would really work like imagine in practice. We have heard of some branded drug manufacturers already announcing investments in U.S. manufacturing plants. but that's very incipient, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen across all drug markets and for all different types of drugs that we use in this country.
So what types of drugs and what countries could be most affected if there were to be tariffs on pharmaceuticals for the first time?
That's a great question. So I would just like to make clear that typically we can think about our pharmaceutical supply in two types of drugs. On the one hand, we have branded products. These products are protected by intellectual property like patents. And the company that holds the patent, they have a large control over the production of that drug. What is called monopolistic production. They and their affiliates can produce the drug. These manufacturers, they do have an incentive to relocate exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. If they produce abroad, their product can be so expensive, they may lose market in the US. And so there is an incentive for them to relocate, also because they are the only producer. So they can actually incorporate some of the costs of relocation into the price of their product. The final price. So that's part of the story. The other type of drug, which is generics, these are not patent protected. So in theory, anywhere in the world could produce these drugs. Manufacturers could be located anywhere. And we do know that today, the largest supply of generics comes from countries like India and China and other countries. And about only 15% of generic, especially active ingredients, is produced in the US. And so for these drugs, the question is that incentives would be much lower because the price of these drugs is very low. And any manufacturer that would want to relocate to the US would still have to compete with global markets like India and China, and so where prices can actually be much lower. So that may place an unfair competition for U.S. manufacturers because their prices may not be as competitive as globally sourced drugs.
Even with the tariffs, you're saying it's just so much more expensive maybe to operate a factory for generic drugs in the United States than it is in other countries.
Yes, because generics, they are of generally lower price. So margins are already very low. Companies are not making a huge profit off these products. And the global market has brought prices down significantly. I should mention, for example, that it is estimated that in the United States, we pay 84 cents on average to the dollar that other developed countries pay for the same generic products. So we are getting competitive prices. And the reason for that is that we depend on the global market. Tariffs could bring these prices up. But the question is how much up, and would it be making sense for manufacturers to relocate?
So interesting. I didn't think about it that way. And in general, let me ask you this. We have the branded products and the generic products. Where is this concern over supply more intense? Is it with the branded products, or is it with the generic products, or is it a little bit of both?
This is an excellent question, and the short answer is that the concern lies primarily on generic products. When we look historically in the United States, shortages of drugs have been a big problem. You talk to any hospitals in the nation, and everybody will have stories about how the lack of supply for a certain drug is impacting clinical operations. This has been going on for many, many years. It exacerbated a lot during the pandemic, but it's still there. At the onset of 2024, it was the peak. We had over 300 drugs marked in shortage by the Food and Drug Administration, by the FDA. In 2025, it was about 100 drugs. So, and they span all sorts of different therapeutic areas, all sorts of medical specialties. But generic products, because of their low cost, they are most commonly the ones experiencing shortages. Because these shortages occur, maybe there's a contamination, maybe there's some sort of other manufacturing problem. And generics are the ones that most frequently, is about 70% of the shortages affect generic products.
So if the shortages are in the generic industry, but tariffs are less likely to help with those shortages, it may not be the most matched solution to the problem.
I would agree with that. And also, tariffs might exacerbate shortages, because if you consider a manufacturer located abroad and the manufacturer is already facing very low profit margins, very high pressure to deliver for the lowest cost possible, given a tariff, these pressures could be even more pronounced. And one of the possible unintended consequences of this is that manufacturers may cut corners even more and deliver lower quality products to the US. And, we don't want lower quality products. They fail. They may be contaminated. They may have a series of problems, and that may trigger supply shortages as well.
So it's, in a sense, risky to put tariffs on low-cost drugs like this with the hope that the companies will relocate. They may not relocate, but instead try to find other ways to reduce their costs.
And they may relocate, but not to the U.S. They may relocate to other countries that don't have as high tariffs, that are not as affected. So there may be relocation, but not as originally intended.
If we were to design a strategy to make the supply chain for generic drugs more resilient, to reduce the chance of those shortages that are affecting so many hospitals and healthcare professionals, other than tariffs, what would you put on the agenda?
Well, I think number one is that we often don't even know where these drugs are coming from. Your great question about which countries, where is the supply coming from, what would be the most affected. In truth, we have some insight into the supply chain, but especially for generics, because of their no patent protected status, they could be produced anywhere. And there's also this, it's really a chain, right? There is also this multi-step involved in the production of generic products, where you have some companies producing the active ingredient, that is the actual ingredient that will make the clinical effect in the body. But then there may be other companies involved in transforming that active ingredient into a pill or a solution, and then another company putting the label and packaging. So there may be many, many layers that completely obfuscate where the drug is really coming from. I think number one solution would be, initially, we need to have more clarity, even to understand where drugs come from. And secondly, more clarity on the quality of the drugs and the quality of manufacturing. Today, a purchaser, imagine you're a hospital having to decide where to purchase your drugs from. If you have 5 or 6 different sources, today the only signal you have to make the decision is the price. There's no other information available to help purchasers guide their decisions. If we had, for example, things like quality metrics, so that the hospital could justify paying a little bit more for a product that has better quality or a better track record of not having shortages, that would also help the market correct itself towards better products and a better supply on the long run.
Got it. I now know why your students find you such a great teacher, Dr. Socal. I just had one in my office this morning saying how much he loved your class. That is a really great explanation of what can be done, and I think we'll all be watching to see what happens with the potential for tariffs on pharmaceuticals, and maybe we'll give you a call back.
I think this matters to all of us, and we should all be watching. I fully agree with that.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.